Experts zoomed in on this family portrait and discovered a shocking truth. The cardboard box arrived at the Charleston Heritage Museum on a gray Tuesday morning in March 2024, wrapped in brown packing paper and secured with twine that looked nearly as old as its contents. Sarah Mitchell, the museum's chief curator, signed for the package and carried it to her restoration workroom on the second floor, where morning light filtered through tall windows overlooking the historic district. Inside, nestled among tissue paper and bubble wrap, lay a collection of Victorian-era photographs, letters, and documents. But it was the largest photograph that immediately caught Sarah's attention, a formal family portrait in a deteriorating gilt frame. The glass was cracked in one corner, but still intact. The accompanying note, written in shaky handwriting, explained that these items had belonged to the Peterson family of Charleston. The donor, Margaret Peterson's great-great-granddaughter, was moving to a nursing home and wanted to ensure the family's history was preserved. "I always felt there was something strange about this photograph," the note read. "Maybe you can discover what my grandmother never told us." Sarah carefully removed the frame and examined the photograph under her desk lamp. The image showed a well-dressed family of 7, posed in a Victorian parlor. The father stood behind a seated woman, presumably his wife, surrounded by 5 children of varying ages. Their clothing suggested the photograph was taken in the 1890s. The women wore high-necked dresses with leg-of-mutton sleeves, while the man wore a dark suit with a stiff collar. What struck Sarah most was the formality of the scene. Each family member maintained the rigid posture typical of 19th-century photography, when exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still. The father's hand rested on his wife's shoulder. 3 children stood to the right. 2 sat on ornate chairs to the left. Their expressions were uniformly serious. Smiling was rare in photographs of that era. Sarah placed the photograph on her scanner, preparing to create a digital archive copy. The museum had recently acquired a high-resolution scanner capable of capturing extraordinary detail, funded by a grant for preserving fragile historical documents. As the machine hummed to life, Sarah began researching the Peterson family in the museum's genealogical database. The name wasn't uncommon, but she found several strong leads. A William Peterson operated a cotton brokerage firm in the 1890s and lived on Meeting Street, one of Charleston's most prestigious addresses. Census records confirmed he had a wife named Catherine and multiple children. When the scan completed, Sarah transferred the file to her computer and opened it in her analysis software. She zoomed in, admiring the clarity, the texture of the wallpaper, the intricate lace on Catherine's collar, even individual threads in the upholstery. Then she zoomed in on the children's faces, and her breath caught. Something about one of the children, the smallest girl seated on the left, looked subtly, disturbingly wrong. She appeared to be about 7 years old, wearing a white dress with a dark sash. Her hair was pulled back with a ribbon, and her hands were folded in her lap. At first glance, she looked like any other Victorian child posing for a family portrait. But the high-resolution scan revealed troubling details. The child's eyes weren't quite right, while the other family members had the slightly blurred, tired look caused by holding still during long exposures. This girl's eyes appeared different. They were open, barely, but lifeless. No reflection from the photographer's flash. The whites of her eyes had a cloudy quality. Her skin was noticeably paler than her siblings, almost waxy. Her posture, initially chalked up to a stiff chair, now seemed unnaturally rigid. The other children showed tiny bits of movement blur, proof they were alive and breathing. This child showed none. Most disturbing was the position of her hands. Folded in her lap, they looked held in place, the fingers slightly stiff, and behind the child's back, just barely visible against the dark fabric of the chair, Sarah spotted what looked like a thin wire or support. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." Every curator specializing in 19th-century photography knew about postmortem portraits. In an era of devastatingly high infant mortality and costly photography, many families commissioned photographs of deceased loved ones as final keepsakes. But Sarah had never identified one herself, especially not one where the deceased was posed among living family members. She pulled up reference articles. Post-mortem portraits often showed hidden support stands, eyes painted open on closed lids, or small wires used to hold eyelids open. The goal: make the deceased appear alive, or at least peacefully sleeping. Sarah examined the other children again. The two teenage girls standing to the right looked alert and serious. A boy of about 10 stood between them, his hand resting on his younger brother's shoulder. The younger boy, about 8, sat on the right side of the frame, solemn, but clearly alive. And then there was the smallest girl, the one who didn't belong among the living. Sarah picked up her phone. She needed confirmation. Dr. Robert Chen, a historian specializing in Victorian mourning customs, arrived that afternoon. Sarah led him straight to her workroom. "I think I found a post-mortem portrait," she said. "But it's unusual. The deceased child is posed with living family members." "That's quite rare," Robert replied. Most post-mortem portraits isolated the deceased. Mixing the dead with the living was considered unsettling. Even then, Sarah opened the high-resolution image. Robert studied it silently, zooming in and out. After several minutes, he spoke. "The little girl on the left," he said quietly. "Yes, I believe you're right." He pointed out the cloudy eyes, the pale skin, the rigid posture, the support structure behind her back. Then he showed Sarah what she'd missed. The unnatural angle of the girl's feet, not quite touching the floor, and the complete absence of breathing motion, blur in her chest. Everyone else showed some blur from respiration during the long exposure. She did not. Robert leaned back, cleaning his glasses as he processed the discovery. Between 1,840 and 1,900, 1 in 5 children died before age 5, he said. If a child died without ever being photographed, families often commissioned post-mortem images. It was their only chance to have a likeness. Sarah pulled up the donor's note. The woman who donated this said her grandmother always felt something was strange about the photograph. She refused to discuss it. The family history was never passed down. Robert nodded. By the 1920 and 30, post-mortem photography became taboo. Many families hid or destroyed these images. They felt ashamed of a tradition their ancestors viewed as loving, not morbid. He opened his notebook. "We need to establish 4 things. The identities of everyone in this photograph, which child this is, when she died, and why the family chose to include her among the living rather than pose her separately." Sarah was already typing into the genealogical database. "I found a William Peterson in the 1890 Charleston census. Cotton broker, lived on Meeting Street. Wife Catherine, children listed as Elizabeth, Margaret, Thomas, James, and Emma. Ages ranging from 16 down to 7. Emma would be the youngest," Robert said. "That matches our subject's apparent age. Can you find a death certificate?" Sarah navigated to the state's digital archive of vital records. The database was incomplete for the 19th century, but many Charleston records had been preserved and digitized. She searched for Emma Peterson. Deaths between 1,890 and 1,895. The result appeared almost immediately. Emma Catherine Peterson, Sarah read aloud. Born March 15, 1,885. Died June 3, 1,892. Age 7. Cause of death: scarlet fever. Robert exhaled slowly. Scarlet fever. That was a death sentence for many children in that era. Before antibiotics, the mortality rate was significant. The fever, the rash, the complications. It would have been devastating for the family. Over the next 3 days, Sarah and Robert pieced together the Peterson family's history. The story that emerged was both ordinary and heartbreaking, a reminder that behind every historical photograph lay real people with real grief. William Peterson had built his cotton brokerage from nothing, arriving in Charleston from Virginia in 1870. As a young man with ambition but little capital, by 1880, he had established himself as a reliable middleman between low-country plantations and northern textile mills. He married Catherine Reynolds, daughter of a local merchant. In 1881, their first child, Elizabeth, was born in 1876, followed by Margaret in 1878, Thomas in 1882, James in 1884, and finally, Emma in 1885. City directories and business records painted a picture of steady prosperity. By 1890, Williams' firm occupied offices on East Bay Street, and the family lived in a spacious house on Meeting Street, in the heart of Charleston's elite neighborhood. Newspaper archives revealed more personal details. Elizabeth had won a prize for needlework at the South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition. Thomas played baseball with a youth league. Society pages mentioned Catherine's involvement with St. Michael's Episcopal Church and her work with the Ladies' Benevolent Society. Emma's name appeared only twice in the archives. The first mention was in a brief notice about children's Sunday school performances at St. Michael's in April 1892, where she had recited a poem. The second was her obituary. Robert found the obituary in a bound volume of the Charleston News and Courier at the city library. He photographed the page and sent it to Sarah. Emma Catherine Peterson, beloved youngest daughter of Mr. and Mrs. William Peterson, died at her family's residence on Meeting Street on Friday evening last, June 3rd, of scarlet fever. She was 7 years of age and is mourned by her parents, 2 sisters, 2 brothers, and a large circle of relatives and friends. The funeral service will be held at St. Michael's Episcopal Church on Sunday afternoon at 3. Interment will follow at Magnolia Cemetery. Sarah read the obituary 3 times, imagining the grief-stricken family receiving visitors, preparing for the funeral, trying to comprehend the loss of their youngest child. Scarlet fever spread rapidly through households, and the Petersons must have been terrified that the other children would sicken as well. She pulled up city directories for the years following Emma's death. The family remained on Meeting Street through 1895, then moved to a different address. Williams' business continued operating until 1903, when it appeared to have been absorbed by a larger firm. Catherine died in 1908. William, in 1912. Their obituaries mentioned surviving children, but made no reference to Emma. Robert came to the museum late on Friday afternoon carrying copies of several Victorian photography manuals he had found in the college's special collections. "I've been researching the technical aspects," he said, spreading the books across Sarah's work table. Postmortem photography was a specialized skill. Not every photographer would agree to do it, and those who did used specific techniques. He opened one manual to a marked page. They had to work quickly, usually within 24 to 48 hours of death before decomposition became visible. They used cosmetics to add color to the skin, positioned the body with stands and supports, and often propped the eyes open or painted them on closed lids. The goal was to create a final image a family could cherish, something that showed their loved one at peace. Sarah studied the diagrams, disturbed by the clinical descriptions of such intimate grief. But why include Emma in a family portrait? Why not photograph her alone, as these manuals suggest? Robert closed the book thoughtfully. "That's the question I keep returning to. My theory is that the family didn't have any photographs of Emma, or possibly any of the children. Photography was still expensive in 1892, especially large-format portraits like this. When Emma died, they faced a choice: photograph her alone, or finally commission the family portrait they had been putting off, including her one last time." Sarah's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While searching through Charleston business directories from the 1890, she found listings for several photography studios. One name appeared repeatedly in advertisements: Harrison and Sons Photography, established 1879, specializing in family portraits and memorial photographs. The studio's location was listed as Broad Street, just blocks from the Peterson residence. Sarah felt a surge of excitement. If the Petersons had used a local photographer, there might be records. She called the Charleston Historical Society to ask about studio archives. The librarian she spoke with was intrigued. Harrison and Sons operated until 1924. When they closed, the family donated their negative collection and business records to us. They've been in storage for decades, thousands of glass plate negatives and dozens of ledger books. "Could I come look at the ledgers?" Sarah asked. 2 hours later, she sat in the Historical Society's climate-controlled archive room, surrounded by leather-bound ledger books. Each volume listed client names, dates, types of photographs, and prices. The handwriting was meticulous. She started with the ledger covering 1891, 1893. Her eyes scanned each page. She found it halfway through 1892. The 7th of June, 1892. Peterson, William, Meeting Street. Family portrait. Large format. Memorial arrangement. $15. A chill ran through her. Memorial arrangement. In the margin, written later in darker ink, was a note. Difficult session. Family distressed. Child required extensive support. Mrs. Peterson requested all children together. First and final portrait. So, Sarah photographed the page and texted Robert. 30 minutes later he arrived. First and final portrait. He read aloud. So I was right. The Petersons had never commissioned a family portrait before Emma's death. This was their only chance to have an image of all their children together. They requested the negative collection. The archivist brought out a drawer filled with hundreds of glass plates. After cross-referencing, they found the correct one. Negative. No. 1,247. The negative showed the same scene Sarah had been studying, but seeing it as the original glass plate felt almost sacred. May I see the other negatives from that session? Sarah asked. Photographers typically took multiple exposures. The archivist checked 3 plates had been taken that day. The first showed the family in a slightly different arrangement. The second negative made Sarah's stomach tighten. Emma alone, lying on a small sofa, eyes closed, hands folded across her chest. A traditional postmortem portrait. They took both, Robert said quietly. A memorial portrait of Emma alone, and the family portrait, including her. They probably kept the family image, because it was the only one with all 6 children together. With the photographer identified, Sarah and Robert began searching for more information about J. Harrison, the man behind the Peterson portrait. Local newspaper archives revealed that James Harrison had been a prominent Charleston photographer, known for his technical skill and sensitivity in handling difficult situations. In an 1889 Charleston newspaper article about local businesses, Harrison discussed his approach to memorial photography with surprising candor for the era. When families come to me after losing a child, Harrison had said, they are in the depths of grief. My role is not merely to operate a camera, but to help them create a lasting memory that will bring comfort. I handle each case with the utmost respect and care. The deceased child is not a mere subject. They are someone's beloved son or daughter, and I treat them accordingly. The article continued. Mr. Harrison has developed techniques for posing deceased subjects that create natural, peaceful images. He employs cosmetics to restore color to the skin, supports to maintain natural positions, and careful lighting to soften the harsh reality of death. His memorial portraits are sought throughout the Lowcountry by families seeking to preserve the memory of departed loved ones. Robert found additional context in Victorian mourning guides and etiquette books. The elaborate rituals surrounding death in the 19th century were foreign to modern sensibilities, but they represented genuine attempts to process profound grief. Victorian society didn't hide from death the way we do now, Robert explained. They confronted it directly, created rituals around it, and found ways to memorialize and honor the dead. Postmortem photography was part of that culture. It wasn't morbid to them. It was loving. Sarah located the Peterson family plot at Magnolia Cemetery, one of Charleston's historic burial grounds. On a warm Saturday morning, she and Robert drove out to find Emma's grave. Magnolia Cemetery sprawled across 150 acres, filled with elaborate Victorian monuments, ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss, and manicured paths winding between family plots. They found the Peterson section near a small pond marked by a substantial granite obelisk inscribed with William's name and dates. Surrounding the obelisk were smaller markers for family members. Catherine's grave was there, as were William's parents and several other relatives. Emma's marker was a small white marble stone, weathered by more than a century of Charleston's humid climate, but still legible. Emma Catherine Peterson. March 15, 1885. June 3, 1892. Suffer the little children to come unto me. Sarah placed her hand on the cool marble, thinking about the 7-year-old girl who had died terrified and feverish, whose parents had loved her enough to insist she be included in the family's only photograph. The stone was modest, but its location directly in front of the family obelisk suggested Emma had remained central to her family's memory. I wonder how the other children processed this, Sarah said. Elizabeth was 16 when Emma died. Margaret was 14, old enough to fully understand and remember. Thomas would have been 10, James 8. That photograph must have been incredibly painful for them to look at. Robert crouched down to examine the inscription more closely. There's another marker here, he said, pointing to a small, flat stone partially obscured by grass. He pulled aside the growth to reveal the inscription. In memory of Margaret Rose Peterson, 1878-1956, forever with Emma. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. Margaret had been the donor's great-great-grandmother, the one who had refused to discuss the photograph. She chose to be buried next to her sister, even though she married and had her own family. Emma's death stayed with her for her entire life. They spent another hour in the cemetery photographing the markers and noting the layout of the family plot. As they walked back to the car, Sarah's phone rang. It was David Kimmel, the museum's director. Sarah, I've been hearing about your Peterson photograph discovery. The board is interested in mounting an exhibit about Victorian mourning practices. Could you develop a proposal? Back at the museum, Sarah and Robert began assembling everything they had learned into a coherent narrative. The Peterson family photograph would be the centerpiece of an exhibit exploring Victorian attitudes toward death, childhood mortality, and memorial photography. Sarah reached out to the donor, asking if she would be willing to share any family stories or documents. The woman, Dorothy Ellis, was intrigued by Sarah's discoveries. I always knew there was something unusual about that photograph, Dorothy said during a phone call. My grandmother Margaret, not the Margaret in the photo, but her daughter, named after her Aunt Emma's sister, used to say her mother would never talk about the family portrait. It hung in a back hallway, not in any prominent location. When I inherited it, I felt like I should keep it, but I could never bring myself to display it. Dorothy agreed to meet at the museum and bring any other Peterson family material she might have. She arrived the following Tuesday, carrying a small wooden box. These belong to my grandmother, Dorothy explained. She gave them to me before she passed in 2003. I haven't looked through them in years. Inside the box were letters, a small Bible, a locket containing a tiny daguerreotype of a young woman, and a leather-bound journal. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the journal. The entries were dated 1892 to 1895, written in a precise, feminine hand. This is Margaret Peterson's diary, Sarah breathed. Emma's older sister. She carefully turned to entries from June 1892. Robert and Dorothy looked over her shoulder as Sarah read aloud. June 1892. Emma's fever continues to climb. Dr. Bradley came again this evening and looks grave. Mama will not leave her bedside. Elizabeth and I try to care for Thomas and James, but they know something is terribly wrong. I pray God will spare our sweet sister. June 4, 1892. Emma is gone. She left us last evening at 6. I cannot write more. The pain is unbearable. Sarah turned several pages, passing through blank entries until the writing resumed. June 7, 1892. The funeral was yesterday. Today, Papa arranged for Mr. Harrison to come to the house with his camera. Mama insisted that we must have a photograph of the family, all of the family together. I understood what she meant, though the thought fills me with horror and grief. Elizabeth wept and said she could not bear it. But Mama was firm. We have no image of Emma, she said. When we are gone, how will anyone know she existed? How will they know she was loved? Sarah's voice caught. She paused, collecting herself, then continued. Mr. Harrison arrived with his equipment and his assistant. They brought Emma from the funeral home where she had been prepared. She looked almost herself in her white Sunday dress, her hair brushed and ribboned as she liked it. But she was not herself. She was a shell, an echo. They positioned us in the parlor. Papa stood behind Mama's chair. Elizabeth, Thomas, and I stood to one side. James sat on the other. And Emma, they placed Emma on a chair beside James, using some device to hold her upright. They positioned her hands and turned her head just so. Mr. Harrison even adjusted her eyelids to make her appear as though she might only be sleeping, though it fooled no one. The exposure took several minutes. I had to stand perfectly still, looking at my dead sister, pretending we were simply posing for a family portrait. James began to cry silently. Mama's face was stone. Papa's hand on her shoulder trembled. When it was finished, they took Emma away again. We will bury her tomorrow in the family plot. Mama says the photograph will be a comfort someday. I cannot imagine how. The room was silent. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes. Robert removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his temples. Sarah carefully turned more pages, looking for additional references to the photograph. July 15th. 1892. The photographs arrived from Mr. Harrison. 2 images, one of Emma alone, peaceful on the settee, and one of all of us together. Papa put the single portrait of Emma in his study. The family portrait will hang in the upstairs hall. Mama spends long minutes staring at it. I cannot bear to look. Word of Sarah's discovery spread through Charleston's historical community. Local newspapers ran features about the Peterson photograph. A producer from South Carolina Public Radio interviewed Sarah and Robert for a segment about Victorian mourning customs. The museum's website posted a preview of the upcoming exhibit, and the response was overwhelming. We've had over 200 emails, David Kimmel told Sarah. Half are from people sharing their own family stories about postmortem photographs. The other half are from scholars and researchers asking to study the Peterson materials. Sarah worked with the museum's exhibit designer to create a sensitive, informative display. The Peterson family photograph would be the centerpiece, but they would also include context. Other examples of Victorian postmortem photography, borrowed from museums and private collections, medical information about scarlet fever and childhood mortality in the 19th century, and explanations of Victorian mourning customs. Most importantly, they would tell Emma's story not as a curiosity or morbid artifact, but as a reminder of a real child who had been loved and mourned by her family. Robert contributed historical context panels, explaining Victorian attitudes toward death in the 19th century. One panel read, When why never torty. When one panel read, Death was a visible, unavoidable part of daily life. Before modern medicine, infectious diseases killed thousands of children every year. Families dealt with death not by avoiding or denying it, but by creating rituals and customs that allowed them to grieve openly and honor their dead. Post-mortem photography was one way families preserved the memory of children who would otherwise be forgotten. Sarah arranged to have Margaret Peterson's diary entries professionally transcribed and displayed alongside the photograph. Reading Margaret's words, visitors would understand the emotional reality behind the image, the grief, the love, the desperate desire to ensure Emma would be remembered. Dorothy Ellis donated several additional items for the exhibit. A small portrait of Emma painted from the photograph, a lock of her hair preserved in a locket, and a program from her funeral service at St. Michael's Church. Each item helped build a fuller picture of Emma as a real person, not just a subject in a disturbing photograph. The museum also created an interactive element. Visitors could access a database of Charleston families who had lost children in the 19th century, seeing the scale of child mortality and reading brief biographies. Emma Peterson would be one entry among hundreds, a reminder that her story was tragically common. 2 weeks before the exhibit opening, Sarah received an unexpected package. Inside was a small, framed photograph with a note from a woman named Patricia Reynolds. Dear Miss Mitchell, the note read, I'm a descendant of Catherine Peterson's sister. Your newspaper article prompted me to search through my family's papers. I found this photograph, which I believe shows Emma Peterson alive. It was taken at a family gathering in 1891. I thought you might want to include it in your exhibit. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the photograph. It showed a group of children at what appeared to be a birthday party or holiday celebration. And there, front and center, was Emma Peterson, smiling, vibrant, unmistakably alive. Her eyes sparkled with joy. Her hair was slightly mussed. She looked like she had been running and laughing moments earlier. Sarah immediately called Robert. We have a photograph of Emma alive, she said. The family needed this. We need this. Now visitors will see her as she was, not just as she appeared in death. We have an essay. We have a photograph of Emma. 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 The exhibit opened on a cool October evening. The museum had planned for a modest crowd, but over 300 people filled the galleries. Dorothy Ellis attended with several other Peterson descendants, including Patricia Reynolds, who had provided the photograph of Emma alive. Sarah arranged the exhibit chronologically. Visitors entered through a section explaining Victorian childhood and family life, seeing photographs of healthy, happy children at play and in celebration. The photograph Patricia had donated was prominently displayed here, showing Emma full of life. The next section addressed childhood mortality rates, disease, and the emotional impact on families. Medical displays offered information about scarlet fever, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and other diseases that had killed thousands of children in the 19th century. Quotes from parents' letters and diaries illustrated the universal nature of grief. The third section introduced postmortem photography as a cultural practice. Examples from other museums showed various types of memorial portraits, always presented respectfully with historical context. Robert's text explained, "Modern viewers may find these photographs disturbing, but to Victorian families, they were precious keepsakes. Often the only image they would have of a deceased child. These photographs were displays of love, not morbidity." Finally, visitors entered the gallery containing the Peterson family portrait. Sarah had designed the space carefully. The photograph hung alone on one wall, properly lit, but not spotlighted. Beside it were the diary excerpts from Margaret Peterson, the funeral program, Emma's portrait painted from the photograph, and historical context about the Peterson family. On the opposite wall hung the photograph of Emma alive, placed at the same height and size as the family portrait. The juxtaposition was powerful. Life and death, joy and grief, memory and loss. The final element was a small alcove with a guest book where visitors could share thoughts or their own family stories. Within the first hour, dozens of entries appeared. "My great-grandmother lost 3 children to disease. She never spoke about them, and we only learned their names from census records. Thank you for honoring these children's memories. I had never heard of postmortem photography before tonight. I understand now that it came from love, not ghoulishness. Emma Peterson died 132 years ago. But tonight, I feel like I know her. That is the power of preservation and storytelling." Dorothy Ellis stood before the family portrait for a long time, Robert and Sarah beside her. "I used to think this photograph was creepy," Dorothy said quietly. "I couldn't understand why the family had done this. But now I see it differently. My great-great-grandmother, Catherine, was terrified that Emma would be forgotten. She insisted on including her one last time, and because of that decision, we're all standing here tonight, remembering a little girl who died in 1892. Catherine got her wish." Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. This was why she had become a curator, to bridge the gap between past and present, to give voice to the voiceless, to ensure that stories like Emma's were not lost to time. The exhibit ran for 6 months. During that time, more than 15,000 people visited. Local schools brought students to discuss Victorian history and the historical evolution of attitudes toward death. Medical students came to learn about 19th century disease and public health. Photography students studied the technical aspects of early image making. But most visitors came simply to see Emma Peterson's portrait and to remember that behind every historical artifact is a human story worthy of being told. A year after the exhibit closed, Sarah received a letter from the American Museum of Photography in Philadelphia. They wanted to feature the Peterson portrait in a traveling exhibition about the history of family photography in America. The exhibit would visit major cities across the country over 3 years. Your research and contextualization transformed this from a curiosity into an educational tool. The curator wrote, "We believe Emma Peterson's story can help millions of people understand both Victorian culture and the universal nature of grief and love." Sarah agreed with one condition. The photograph of Emma alive had to travel with the family portrait. Visitors needed to see both the joy and the sorrow, the life and the death. Dorothy Ellis approved enthusiastically. She had become an advocate for historical preservation, speaking at genealogical society meetings about the importance of saving family photographs and documents. If I had thrown away that portrait because it made me uncomfortable, Emma's story would have been lost forever, she told audiences. Instead, thousands of people now know about her. That little girl who died at 7 has touched lives more than a century after her death. Robert published an academic paper about postmortem photography in the Journal of Southern History, using the Peterson case as his primary example. His research sparked renewed interest in the practice, leading to additional exhibitions and studies at museums across the country. For Sarah, the Peterson photograph remained on her mind long after the exhibit closed. She began researching other postmortem portraits in Charleston, discovering dozens of similar cases. Each represented a family's love and grief children, who had been remembered by parents desperate to hold on to their memory. She started a digital archive project, working with local historical societies to identify and preserve postmortem photographs from across South Carolina. The goal was to document these images before they were lost or destroyed, ensuring that children like Emma would not be forgotten. On the anniversary of Emma's death, June 3rd, Sarah made a practice of visiting Magnolia Cemetery. She would place flowers on Emma's grave and spend a few minutes standing in the shade of the oak trees, thinking about the little girl who had died of scarlet fever in 1892. During one visit, she found fresh flowers already there. A note was attached. "For Emma, from your family. We remember you still." Sarah looked around and saw Dorothy Ellis walking toward her along the cemetery path. "I come every year now," Dorothy said. "Since learning her story, I feel connected to her. She's not just a name in a family tree anymore. She's real to me." They stood together at the grave, two women separated by generations but united in their determination to honor Emma's memory. "You know what's remarkable?" Sarah said. "Catherine Peterson wanted to ensure Emma would be remembered. She made the difficult decision to include her deceased daughter in that family portrait, knowing it would be painful to look at. And 132 years later, her wish came true. Emma is remembered. Her story has been told to thousands of people. That photograph, which seemed so morbid, became exactly what Catherine hoped it would be. A testament to love that transcended death." Dorothy nodded. "My grandmother Margaret spent her whole life trying to forget that photograph. But maybe that wasn't what Emma needed. Maybe she needed us to remember, to acknowledge her life and her family's love. That's what you helped us do." Sarah thought about all the photographs still hidden in attics and storage boxes, waiting to be discovered. Each one represented a story, a life, a moment in time that mattered to someone. The Peterson photograph had taught her that even difficult, uncomfortable artifacts deserved to be preserved and understood, not destroyed or hidden away. Emma Peterson's story had begun with a tragic death in 1892, but it had been reborn in 2024, when a curator looked closely at an old photograph and saw past the disturbing surface to the love and grief beneath. And now that story would continue, told to new generations, ensuring that a little girl who died at 7 would never truly be forgotten. As Sarah left the cemetery that day, she thought about the inscription on Emma's grave marker. "Suffer the little children to come unto me." It was a common Victorian epitaph, a reference to the biblical passage where Jesus welcomed children. But to Sarah, it now carried additional meaning. The inscription was not just about Emma going to heaven, it was also an invitation to the living, to come to Emma, to remember her, to know her story, to ensure she remained part of the human family even in death. And thanks to a disturbing photograph, a careful investigation, and a community willing to confront an uncomfortable past, that invitation had been accepted. Emma Peterson, silent in death for 132 years, had finally been given a voice. Her story had been told, her life honored, and her memory secured. The photograph that had once been hidden in a back hallway too painful to display had become a bridge across time, connecting past to present, death to life, and grief to love. It was a reminder that behind every historical artifact, no matter how strange or unsettling, lies a human story waiting to be heard. And Emma's story, at last, had been heard.